Hello, New Prospect family. Welcome to RTB 2021 for April 27th, 2021. Hope you're doing well this day. So let's launch right into our text. We've got Numbers 4, and then we have Psalm 38, then Song of Solomon 2, and then Hebrews 2. I'll probably spend more time on Song of Solomon and Hebrews this time than the first two, but we'll see how that works out. We'll start with Numbers chapter 4 today. So remember that we're in the midst of these preparations for the promised land. And at this point, there is no hint of problems in the camp of Israel. Everything is going well as they prepare to go into the promised land. Here we have some numbering of the individual tribes of the Levites. And specifically, we have the clans within the Levite tribe. The Gershonites, the Kohathites, and then the Merarites. These have various duties, and you'll see these duties kind of outlined. There's not a lot of additional details than what we had from earlier on these individual clans. But what it does is it again highlights the centrality of the Levites, because remember the camp was surrounding the tabernacle. This is where the priests and the Levites would serve, but of course the Levites were to be stationed intermixed within the entirety of the nation once they got into the promised land, and this of course was to sanctify that nation. But this also points to, I think, something of the nature of the conquest itself as they're going in. This is not so much a military conquest as it is a conquest that is spiritually oriented and driven. So this is the success or failure, in other words, for the Israelites was going to be based upon their obedience to Torah, their faithfulness to Yahweh within the covenant. This is what makes some of the failures that we'll encounter later on in the book of Numbers so significant, because those failures were spiritual failures, whether it's the murmuring and complaining, whether it's the unbelief in the promises of God that we'll find with the spies episode later on in the book of Numbers. These are all things that are spiritual failures, and the conquest was a spiritual endeavor. So their success was going to be based on their faithfulness and such. And so these Levite clans had a very central role in the conquest itself as they're preparing for this great conquest of the promised land. Moving on to Psalm 38, we have a psalm that's an individual lament, but it's also a penitential psalm. Now, let me explain what it means to be penitential. In fact, I have on the title of my in my Bible that I'm holding here, the title is "The Prayer of a Suffering Penitent." What does that mean? That means that a penitential psalm is somebody who's confessing sin. In fact, it's used this way. One of the early churches' penitential psalms, along with Psalm 32 and Psalm 51 and Psalm 6 and others, that were used corporately by the church to express confession of sin. So penitential is meaning that you're, again, confessing and expressing sorrow and lamentation over your own personal sin. And so, for instance, when we get to the end of this psalm, the psalmist is crying out. Again, this is a psalm of David, but the psalmist is crying out, "For I confess my iniquity, I'm full of anxiety because of my sin," verse 18. And because of this, he cries out that asking God not to forsake him, not to be far from him, to hasten to his help, and to be his salvation. So this is a psalm, I think, that can be used not just to express sorrow for sin corporately, but also, I think, individually as well. Psalms are good, again, for not just, and remember that Psalms are not just for the expression of emotion or the expressing what we're feeling in our spiritual walks at any point in time, but they're also teaching us something, aren't they? They're teaching us, in the case like this, how to express sorrow over sin to God. teaching us that God is a God who does hear our confessions of sin, who does respond and helps when we confess our sin. He is faithful and righteous to forgive our sin, as John states, and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And a psalm like that teaches us that very thing. So psalms are things that not just inform the intellect, and not just give expression to the heart, but also direct the will. All right, moving on to Song of Solomon, chapter 2. So Song of Solomon, once again, is this sexually charged book for a properly oriented sexually charged book for a promiscuously oriented sexually charged culture. And there's a deep theology of sexuality here that I think is really beautiful and also necessary for the church to get a hold of. And I think you find in this text, in our text for today, a very significant passage that gets to the heart of the theology that's being presented here, the theology of sexuality that's presented here in this song. So the song, I think, is a song that is not just it's not just celebrating sexuality for sexuality's sake. It's celebrating sexuality as the picture of the union of a husband and wife in covenantal love. In this way, it really does show something of what God intended for the sexual union is an expression of the oneness of the husband and wife. And in the Old Testament context, if you ever want to summarize the covenant relationship between God and his people, you'll have something like, I'm your God and you're my people. You read this all throughout the Pentateuch, for instance. Even in the prophets, you'll find this. That's just a simple summary statement of the covenant relationship between God and his people. Well, the marriage relationship is a covenant relationship as well, a deep bonded relationship between a husband and wife who are coming together on the basis of true, active covenant love. They're coming together on the basis of promises that they're making to each other, commitments that they're making to each other, and they are showing faithfulness. This is what a covenant relationship is all about. This is what Israel was supposed to be to God and what God was supposed to, had promised to do for his people, to be committed to them, to be faithful to them. This is what we are supposed to, as a church, to be to Christ, right? Christ is we are the bride of Christ as the church, and Christ is committed to his church. So to the extent that he died for us, as Paul talks about in Ephesians 5. And again, that relationship is, I am your God and you're my people. Well, look at verse 16 of Song of Solomon, chapter 2. My beloved is mine and I am his. This is kind of the synopsis of this covenant marital relationship that is obviously one that is in a very real sense pictured by the sexual union, and yet it is reflective of that deep, committed, loyal oneness that comes in a covenant relationship. And if churches, I think, if the church as a whole in the world and Christians can recover something of that covenant nature of love, of marriage, and of sexuality, that would go a long way towards healing some of the wounds that a false view, a wrong view of sexuality and marriage have created in our churches and in the Christian community at large. We can say more about that, I think, in coming days as well. But I think this verse 16 was something that really struck me about the kind of the theology of sexuality is being presented here as a sexuality that's reflecting a union of a covenant, the union that occurs in the covenant relationship. All right, moving on to Hebrews chapter 2. So speaking of the the truth of God providing a way of healing and forgiveness that the psalmist talks about in Psalm 38. This is a text in Hebrews that speaks of the work of Christ on our behalf, and perhaps some of the clearest ways that we find in the New Testament as a whole. You got a couple of things going on in here. Again, it's continuing to talk, the author of Hebrews is continuing to talk about the superiority of Christ. Remember that the author of Hebrews is focused on a very high Christology, showing the superiority of Christ of anything that we find in the Old Testament, anything that we find in the created order. Another thing that you'll find in, I'm not going to spend much time on this today. I'll wait till later text to talk about it. Another thing that you find in chapter 2 that's going to be very common throughout the rest of the book of Hebrews are these so-called warning passages. So this actually begins with a warning passage in chapter 2, verses 1 and following, where he says, for this reason, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard so that we do not drift away from it. So these warning texts are things that we'll find. And again, I'll explain those further in a few days, particularly when we get to chapter 4, where we have one of the more famous warning texts. But I wanted to spend just the rest of our time together with verse 14 and following, which really speaks of the greatness of our salvation, something we've been talking about with all our sermon series, the Amazing Grace, Amazing Gospel, that we've been engaged in for these past few weeks. And it speaks of not just that, the amazing grace of the gospel, but also the wonderful work of Christ on our behalf. So let me just read this to you. Therefore, since the children share in the flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same. In other words, Jesus became flesh and blood to suffer for us on our behalf. And he must have been flesh and blood in order to do that, right? So he had to be 100% God and 100% man. That through his death, he might render powerless him who had power over death, that is the devil. He made impotent the devil in his attempts to control the life and death itself. And as we'll read in the book of Revelation, Christ has the keys to death and Hades, so that he might free those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. That's an interesting way of thinking about our existence as humanity, isn't it? That as fallen humans, we're enslaved to sin, but there's also a sense in which we're enslaved to the effects of sin, that is to death itself. And there's this knowledge of the reality of death that we all have, and that it is the product of this sinful world, because the wages of sin ultimately is death, Paul tells us. But he has set us free from that, even from the fear of that thing that has subjected us, that is death itself. And those of you who have seen strong believers in Christ, who have approached that moment of the final moments of life and have faced it. I have a friend right now who's this very day facing the last days of his life, and he is facing it with this kind of confidence, fearlessness, because of Christ's victory over death. For assuredly he does not give help to the angels, but he gives help to the descendant of Abraham. Therefore he had to be made like his brethren, in all things, so that he might be the merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make propitiation for the sins of his people. Propitiation is basically referring to appeasing the wrath of God towards sin, the righteous wrath of God. And God had that wrath appeased through this faithful high priest. This will be another theme of the book of Hebrews, that he is our great high priest. Davis even preached on this a few weeks ago, talking about the priestly role of Christ in our life. And he is the one who gives us ultimate access to that throne of grace because of his work for us. He had that mediatorial role, and we don't need any other priest. Jesus is our priest. For since he was tempted in that which he has suffered, he is able to come to the aid of those who are tempted. So some great pictures of the work of Christ on our behalf. So I think this is an appropriate text to end today with, and I hope you and pray that you'll continue to meditate on God's great work on your behalf through his son, Jesus Christ. on this day, April 27th, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.